Welcome to Mershman Seeds Cup of Joe. You'll need to grab 2 cups of coffee for this one. We've got a lot to cover. On this episode, our special guest this week, Chad Hart, crop market specialist from Iowa State University, discusses the future of crop markets and why it's important to play the long game and plan for the future. Ben discusses what to plant first, corn or soybeans, and the importance of double-checking your local crop insurance planting dates. Follow along as Joe talks about Dick Moore's planting guide. You can find it in the link in our bio or on our website.
Hi, this is Joe Mershman. Welcome to Mershman Seeds Cup of Joe, episode number 35, season 3. Today we have Tommy, Turk, and Ben, and a special guest from Iowa State University, Chad Hart, crop market specialist, affectionately known as Dr. Doom when it comes to markets. So, we were off air and I was saying, they can't possibly call you that now because, hey, markets are good and, I think farmers are going to have a great year. Well, Chad, I'm going to turn it over to you and tell us what you know right now because everybody's pretty happy right now, but they're really nervous about the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's the whole point here is that we should be both of those. We should be really happy where we're at right now. We have seen prices increase dramatically over the past 8 months. And we see some profitable levels out there. At the same time, too, as we look further down the road, we know farming is a competitive industry. And that if you have higher prices, that tends to mean higher costs are coming sometime in the future, narrowing up that profit margin as we go forward. And this is a scenario that we go through periodically over time. When you think back through, say, the 2010s, the idea is that we had very profitable levels early in the decade. And then, we struggled some on the back half. And we're likely, as we go forward, going to face that same sort of, the highs and lows of the marketplace as we move through time. So you've got to enjoy the highs while you've got them. Hopefully put some things away, bank some things away so that when we see those lows, you have something to fall back on.
Well, I think right now most farmers a lot of their inputs are locked in for this year, and you have the opportunity to lock some prices in. They're really asking the question, how high are these markets going to go? We're talking about a early spring right now. I've seen farmers working the fields already this year in Illinois and southeast Iowa here. The question they're concerned about, okay, we're kind of a dry start. Does that mean we're going to have a dry summer? Are these markets capable of going higher from where we're at right now if we start getting a little bit drier come June and July?
I think they are. And that's sort of what we saw, as we got, finished up March and we saw the Acreage Report and we saw the markets definitely react. They showed a willingness to go higher and quickly if they think that supplies are going to be shorter, especially given the demand that we've got for our crops right now. When you look at how our export season's gone thus far, it's been very strong for both corn and soybeans. We continue to see fairly strong feed demand as our livestock industries are still producing at record levels. And then when you look at the biofuel side of it, while that has been hurt by, the COVID crisis and the restrictions that we put upon ourselves to avoid that disease, we have seen that industry bounce back to about 90% of what it was pre-COVID. And so when you add all that up, what you've got is incredibly strong demand right now. That is, that the market's worried will overwhelm the supplies that we're able to create.
They had the reports that came out this past week and, really caught the trade off guard, if you will. And of course, everybody's saying, well, I think the government's maybe off on this. Maybe the numbers aren't right. What do you say, Chad? You think the numbers are? I know we have to work with what we got, but I think there's more room for these acres to go up, and I think they will, don't you?
Well, I think they can. I'll put it that way. I think when you look here, you recognize one that this survey, the numbers are based upon a survey that was put forward to farmers late February, early March. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to, I think, this case of just like, Joe, you mentioned they've locked in some of their inputs already. Well, I think they locked in those inputs at a time when, prices were lower. So they weren't necessarily buying the inputs for a big expansion because you were still looking at less profitable opportunities at the time. And so I think that factors into the acreage report that we saw. I think the dry conditions factor in as well, that farmers are worried, yeah, I can put that seed in the ground, but if I'm not getting the moisture that I'm going to need to produce that crop, maybe I need to pull back a bit. And I think that not only influenced the number of acres that we said we would plant, but also the crop mix that we're planting out there. One of the biggest things that popped out to me in that report was how corn only gained about 300,000 acres, but sorghum gained over 1 million. So that indicated to me that you got farmers, especially out in the southern and central plains, that said, we believe this drought's here for a while. We need to plant the more drought resistant crop. And so I think you saw some of that in this as well. But I would agree that, okay, it looks like an early spring and we are drier than usual, especially across the western corn belt. And typically that means enhanced planting going on, at least in the early part of the season.
As we look to our South American friends and we see things going on down there, what's going to be the reaction down there with these prices?
Well, that's the deal. I think they're definitely looking to react, and it's sort of like we expected here. I mean, I think, one, they're facing some of the same weather problems we are. If you think about it, drought has been a problem down there as well. There have been these same discussions about will their dry conditions continue as well? And so I think it's sort of like us. We're expecting them to expand, especially given these price signals, but they may not expand quite as much as we anticipated, just like we got the numbers from USDA, in that there are other limiting factors here that may pull back on that growth. Price is not the only thing you have to worry about here. To go back to Joe's first question, costs are changing here as well. And so especially for those South American producers, they're facing some of the higher input costs that we didn't have to right now because we've already pre-purchased those inputs.
We talked a little bit about the opportunity that farmers have to price out multiple years production, but we really can't protect or lock out multiple years costs of everything. So there's going to be a fine line on how much do you do there, isn't it, Chad?
Yeah, there is a fine line, and you don't want to get too aggressive, especially when you're looking fairly far out. But when you think about the futures market right now, as we look out to 2022, 2023, we're staring at, corn prices north of 40 as we look out there 2-3 years out. We've got soybean prices 2 to 3 years out that are still in double digits. These are price levels, let's face it, we haven't seen in almost a decade. And so they do offer up an opportunity, but you're right, we don't want to be so aggressive that we lock in prices such that we can't also react with cost, do reach those levels as well. So we want to put in some price protection, but not be overly aggressive about it.
Chad, you said before we started filming that basically farming is break even. So over time. In other words, average costs,
Over time.
average price. And so right now, the farmers for this year got maybe input costs fairly low, good opportunity for pricing. But then next year, things are going to, like you said, explain that situation. What happens next year when farmers are looking at next year? What are they really looking at when they start thinking about pricing opportunities for the following year?
Well, I think you look at, farming in the long run, we call it's a competitive industry. People can get in and out of farming. And so when you look at, for example, what we're seeing right now, you get corn with a 5 in front of it, and that excites a lot of farmers across the country to want to plant more corn. And we are seeing more corn planted this year. Well, that has a twofold impact on our profit margin. One, since more corn is getting planted, that usually means prices start to drop. You're increasing supplies. At the same time, too, since we're trying to grow more corn, we're bidding up those inputs because everybody's chasing after the same inputs to produce corn. that raises price. And so what that does is it's a natural, if you will, mechanism that helps drive that profit margin back towards zero. Arguably, the same thing happens when it's the opposite. When our costs are high and our prices are low, we pull back on production. What that tends to do is lower supplies, which help raise the price, but it also helps keep costs lower. So costs come down and dang it, that profit margin heads back towards zero again. That's the way farming has worked since basically the dawn of time. And when you look at the history of farming, say over, our lifetimes, you see those swings in profitability where we go from fairly profitable prices to some losses and back and forth we go. But in the long run, we average about zero.
Switching it up just a little bit, Chad, energy costs have gone up pretty steadily in the last 6-8 months. Where do you see crude going? How does that affect farming? And then where do you see energy costs?
Well, that's the deal. I think when we're looking at energy costs, we have seen those rally, sort of like the crop markets, if you will. Part of that has been driven by, the nature of the events that we've seen. For example, the extreme cold snap several weeks ago. That definitely put a pinch on some energy supplies, helping jack those prices up. I think we're also going to see, as we're looking forward here, let's call it a slower price increase as we truly reopen our economies, as we get the vaccines out, start to return life to, let's call it, more of a normal pattern. You're going to see some energy price pressure because of that. But I think it's going to be slower than what we've experienced over the past few months.
Chad, looking into your crystal ball, is there anything that you see in the next year that's surprising to you?
There's always something. I think I'll put it this way. The big things I'm watching for surprises, and I guess I'll try to give you one on the upside and one on the down. I would argue if you're looking for upside on prices, probably the big thing I'll watch for there is I'm watching the weather conditions. That right now is the biggest threat to me when I'm looking at the supply side of the market. As you've mentioned her earlier, and we're looking at those forecasts, we're already starting in sort of a moisture deficit, especially across the Western Corn Belt. That's the area where we've been seeing the expansion in area. And when I look at the forecast out through this, especially this summer, it shows warmer conditions almost all the way through the growing season, but it also shows increasingly drier conditions as we move forward. And so that does, let's call it, put a little fear into the markets about limited production. If you're looking about what could happen on the downside, it could be this, is that we are pushing prices to a level now where one would expect to see some demand changes. Are we getting our corn and soybean prices high enough where we're going to start seeing adjustments in feed rations here in the U.S.? Are we going to see adjustments in export patterns because suddenly everybody's looking for alternative feed grains to help lower their own costs? And when you think about the rally that we've experienced over this past 6 months, a lot of it has been demand-driven, export-driven, and exports are highly sensitive to price levels.
Chad, what are the alternatives to corn and soybeans? You mentioned sorghum for one. What would they substitute?
That's the deal. I think when you're looking here, you've got to look at what are you using that corn or that soy meal for. And so take for instance, in this case, let's look at China. And what we've seen is that they are willing to use any feed grain that they can and rebalance that ration in any way they need to. So they'll look at corn, they'll look at wheat, they'll look at barley, they'll look at oats, they'll look at sorghum. They're looking at, cottonseed meal, you name it, they're willing to explore that. The big question becomes, when you're looking at those alternatives, can you get the quantities that you need at a relatively competitive price? And how much adjustment do you have to make? And so, when we think about our rations here in the U.S., our farmers don't tend to move that much because there is a cost to adjusting that ration. In other countries, though, they are much more willing to adjust that ration because it's, I guess I'll describe it this way. they're less tied to the daily rate of gain, the sort of the science of the feed ration that we utilize here to help figure out what we need here. So they're more willing to adjust and allow their feeding efficiency to vary.
Talk a little bit about China. Do you think they're going to be good trading partners into the future?
I think they're going to be trading partners in the future. The definition of good there is in the eye of the beholder. But I think what you're looking at is they're going to be large trading partners for us. And, what we've experienced over the past 5 years has been the highs and the lows of that relationship. For example, right now, I don't think there's any way you can't argue that they are our number one customer. They are buying a tremendous amount of corn and soybeans and pork and beef, and you go on down the line. A couple of years ago, we definitely saw the low side of our trade relationship. But I think what we've also seen is that even when we can't agree on trade, we recognize that we still are both large enough that we need to trade with each other, even when we are disagreeing with each other.
Mexico, Canada, and now they're talking about Great Britain as far as being our number one customers going into the future, just because the Great Britain is pulling out of the European Union. Do you see that still continuing, or do you see that we're going to see Great Britain as a better customer?
We'll see Great Britain as a better customer, but I don't think they'll ever necessarily reach the levels of a Mexico or Canada or China. I think when you're looking here, the idea of Mexico and Canada arguably because they're just so close, and it's a fairly affluent country. Mexico, you've got a larger population and growing economy, and again, fairly close. And then let's face it, let's just compare Great Britain and China. You're talking about 1.4 billion people versus maybe 100 million? In the grand scheme of things, even if Great Britain bought almost everything from us, they couldn't necessarily compare to the size of what China can be for us.
Do you think the trade deals that Trump put in place are going to be maintained, and do you feel that they're positive for the U.S. farmer?
So in this case, like USMCA definitely will be maintained. You look at the deals that were struck with South Korea, Japan, definitely. So there, the one that I'm going to say is sort of maintained, but doesn't have a long shelf life would be the phase one deal with China. Because if you go back and look at that deal, it was only a 2-year agreement. And so we're in year 2 now. There's a reason it was titled phase 1, in that everybody knew there needed to be a phase 2. And that is now the challenge for the Biden administration, is figuring out what that phase 2 looks like.
So one last question for you, and we appreciate your time today. If we have what is considered some type of drought, particularly, it looks like that way in the western Corn Belt more so than the eastern Corn Belt, at least based on this subsoil moisture right now. Where are these markets going to go?
Well, I think we've already seen an indication of that. As you sit here now, you've got nearby corn, floating above 550. And, you put not the specter of a drought, but you actually put a drought behind that. And that would say, yeah, we've got something north of 6 in front of us if that were to occur. That beans have already went to 14 and could get to 15 very quickly if the dry conditions continue here. So, I think the market has shown us that indication of it is ready to move higher if this drought continues or spreads. Now, that's not to say it definitely will. I know in talking with some of the climatologists that I've worked with in the past, they're concerned. I would say, I'll put it this way, they're concerned, but they're not overly concerned about it yet. They recognize that what their models seem to suggest is we also have the potential to see, maybe not, I'll call it, an overabundance of moisture, but they see the possibility of let's call it rain at just the right times to get us through, even though we're starting with a dry, a dry start to the crop.
So what you're saying, Chad, is nearby and futures markets are going to come together. We don't know whether the nearby is going to come down to the futures or the futures is going to come up to nearby as we get closer together. It's time that remains to be seen.
Here, we're waiting for that uncertainty to be resolved. And I'm going to argue a lot of it has to do with, let's face it, these dry conditions. The drier we get as we move through the growing season, the more likely, the deferreds are going to come up to meet the nearby. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if we start to see that possibility of export weakness, it will be the opposite direction, that we'll see the nearbys dropping back down to meet the deferreds.
Well, thank you today for the time and we really appreciate you coming on Cup of Joe. And I know our customers always enjoy when you come to Burlington. And last year you weren't able to do that at our crop fair, but hopefully next year we'll see you in person. And we can't thank you enough for the insight, and we always enjoy talking to you.
It's my pleasure to be with you, and I can't wait to get down there as well. Especially, in this case, I'm wearing a baseball jersey. I considered yesterday like a federal holiday. Opening day of baseball is always a beautiful thing. But I hope to get down there and see and visit folks again, because that's the biggest missing point to me in 2020 was interacting with folks, and because that's truly the enjoyable part of the job.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chad.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
Well, that was really good discussion with Chad, and hopefully that will help some of our listeners and watchers on making some of these tough decisions, because it's not a fun time right now from the standpoint of thinking about what's next. Well, thinking about what's next, Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot today a little bit, because farmers are looking at the calendar. It is early, and the field looks pretty good. Should I be getting my planter out? And if I do get my planter out, what should I plant?
I would say that question is entirely dependent on what the soil conditions are when that planter is sitting out next to the field, because when we stress early planting soybeans, all that we're looking for planting soybeans is a 3 or 4 day nice warm period where the soil temperatures are correct, and then soybeans can handle a variety of conditions. It can get cold and wet after that. You imbibe that warm moisture. It can get cold and wet after that point, and they can sit in the ground for 5 weeks. But with corn, you don't want corn sitting in the ground for 5 weeks. You want corn to take the warm drink of water, and you want no stress until that corn plant comes out of the ground. So from what I see in southeast Iowa and looking at field conditions in central Illinois and all the way around, we're looking at 70-degree temperatures for the next, let's call it 4 or 5 days, and they kind of dip off into the mid-60s with lows in the high 40s with a little bit of moisture next week. I'm probably thinking about planting corn first if the conditions are right in those fields that you're chasing, just because you don't want that stress to happen. And there's a higher risk to planting soybeans early because we look at what the average frost date is for the county that you're in. Mm-hmm. A lot of these frost dates can still happen late April, early May. We ran into a little bit of that last year, but with corn, you can frost corn off at V6 and it doesn't affect yield. Well, you can frost corn off at V4, V5 once you hit V6, but there's a longer window once that plant's exposed for risk reward.
It's a little more forgiving than soybeans would be at this time.
Yeah, because if you get a soybean plant up,
we saw it last year, yep.
V1, V2, if it takes a heavy frost freeze event, well, now you're starting over again.
So that growing point's not out of the ground until the V6.
The V6 point.
And where the growing point on the soybean is the very top of that stem.
Correct.
So that's the difference really we're talking about here. And I agree with you, Ben. If the soil conditions are excellent, plant corn. The risk reward for time invested to return on investment probably favors corn much more than it does soybeans if you're gonna jump early. I'd also say that if you're not seeing dust behind that planter, then maybe wait a day or two.
Well, especially a little bit of what Chad's talked about and some of the climatologists, like Joe was saying earlier, if maybe you can hit that pollination a little earlier where it's not as much stress where we're getting in some of these drier months. And soybeans can wait a little longer because obviously, we're used to these August rains. Well, knock on wood, hopefully we get them. But that's something to think about too. And like Joe also said again, look 3 weeks out. See what you got coming down in the future here.
Yeah, the corn thing, there's proper depth, proper spacing is critical to corn. Soybeans, not as much. And there's an old saying I always said, you plant when field conditions are right because that has so much effect on emergence. And the thing with corn is maybe you can drive that tractor a little slower, get a little better placement, a little more even depth. And if you can get that pollination occur before July 4th or, the end of June, is the equinox. And I don't know if you know anything about the weather, but when that earth tilts a little bit differently, we tend to get dry. We tend to get dry. July always dries out. And we take a little lesson from the folks down in southwest Missouri. They've been for years. They don't have the soils like we have in the prairie soils in the I-states, but they typically would go out and plant as early as they possibly could get corn in the ground because they knew it was going to be hot in July, and they wanted pollination to occur before that. And if they knew if they got pollination in before it turned hot and dry, that they could raise corn. And they've been doing that for years and years. In fact, they quit planting corn when it gets what we would call normal corn planting time up here because they know that they're going to hit the pollination at the wrong time. So with forecasts for a little bit warmer, drier summer, maybe a little bit of risk of early planting of some corn makes sense. And it's always fun for a farmer to go out in the field and every square inch of the field is ready to be planted as opposed to having a wet hole or have to go around wet holes. We've seen those years. So, and on soybeans, again, taking some lessons from the Missouri farmers, they never tend to get too big a hurry about planting their soybeans because they know there's always going to be rain in late August. As the temperatures start cooling down, we tend to get rain, and they want to have their soybeans in that pod fill position in late August. So those are things that farmers need to be thinking about. You have anything else to add?
Well, we're at April. This episode airs April 3rd. You can still get your corn planted and potentially still have your beans planted by the 15th of April or the 20th of April. We're really, really early yet. And Chris Ehler said, the facts back it up from what their plots show, their optimum planting date's the 15th of April to the 1st of May. We're still considered early planting soybeans. So, there's...
Right, the crop insurance date for the state of Iowa is April 21st.
Right.
So,
for soybeans.
For soybeans.
If your neighbor's out there running around the field with the planter and you haven't got yours out and looked at it yet, don't just go to the field. Look at your planter, make sure it's ready to go, because the most important thing is to make sure that your planter is doing the job that you want it to do, because everything that we've talked about in all the previous episodes, there's going to, this peer pressure thing is real.
Yes.
And so
not just in junior high.
So when you hook on that planter, if you haven't done it already, which I think most people have, but if you haven't, don't go to the field and start planting until you look it over and make sure everything is working fine, because you only get that one chance.
Right. Planting depth critical if we're going to have a drier summer, right, Ben?
Yeah.
Critical. 2.5 inches
Minimum.
Yep.
2.5 is my minimum, that when I go out and I'm planting with my dad on our farm, we're at 2.5, if not closer to 2 3/4.
Get that better root system. That's exactly what you're getting. You're going to get, and because of a better root system, you get more nutrients in, you get more water in, and you get better pollination and bigger ears. It all comes together.
Standability.
Yep, standability. A lot of things. Anything else on this early planting? Because you've been getting a lot of calls this past week on, should I go? Should I go?
Yep, and it's all risk reward. So I don't. As long as the weather conditions are correct, I don't think there's a. And you have a long-term forecast. It's the earlier you plant, the higher risk you run. It's just, but there could be a higher reward as well. So.
Yeah, the key thing is to remember, always be planting into warmer conditions, not colder, wetter conditions. Because that first drink of water, if it's cold, wet water, you're going to replant.
Yep.
You're going to replant. So, a drier spring typically you're not going to see that issue as much. So those are, I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions personally, but there's plenty of time to plant, and it's the weather after planting that determines yield, not so much the day you plant. And that's hard to realize that, because 2019, when did we plant? We planted a lot of crops in June and still had some pretty awesome yields, didn't we?
Yep.
Was that 2015, 2014 around here, though? We had a lot of corn that went in the ground earlier, and we had a lot of pythium issues in those next couple of years, or that next couple weeks, so to speak. So, like you said, the weather after determines a lot more than the day of you planting. So,
And I will remind everybody that the one year that we had, it froze 2 inches deep on May 12th.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, very unpredictable. So
Very
I'll hit up John Felt, our weather guy, and try to get him to pin him down a little bit. And of course, I know what the weatherman always says. When the longer range you go, the harder and the more inaccurate the forecasts are. But we'll try to get him pinned down a little bit and what he thinks, and send out an email to our customers and what his forecast is for the next past 2 weeks. Now he'll do a week weather briefing on Saturday and this Saturday today, and that would be worth watching, because he's going to look out 2 weeks at that point.
That's true.
And that's going to get us right into what we would normally call normal planting time.
Correct.
So we'll watch that real closely too. Turk, you have anything?
Happy Easter, everyone, and watch John's forecast either before church or after church.
Tommy?
We got time to do it right the first time, so let's just slow down and make a good decision here. So things are right. Let's make sure everything's ready to go. Make sure planter's out of the shed, and like Turk said, we got to get seed soil contact. So make sure we'll go through the planter, so to speak. So
Some of my friends tell me, well, I'm old enough, I don't need to practice anymore. So they tend to wait till they know it's safe. But
seems
anyhow,
like famous last words, right?
Right. Do you need practice? That's the question,
Yeah.
right? I would like to point out, now, if you really want to get scientific about this whole planting thing, what you do is, we're going to link to this. This is the Dick Moore's planting guide. And Dick Moore, you say, who's Dick Moore? Well, he's a salesperson that worked for us, and he's retired. Lives down in central Missouri, down by the Sedalia area. But his grandfather, and Dick, how old's Dick Turk right now? He's pushing 80, isn't he, I'm sure?
Oh, yeah, he's in his 80s.
Yeah. So anyhow, his grandfather taught him, so this goes way back, but it's planting by the signs of the moon. And Dick, when he worked that central Missouri territory, he could walk into a field, and the farmer had something going wrong, particularly right after emergence. He said, "I'll bet you planted on these days." And the farmer would say, "Yeah, how'd you know that?" He said, "Well, it's the wrong time of the moon." And he built a reputation by taking his grandfather's information that he taught him and putting it to the signs of the moon. When's the best time to plant? So if here's another thing maybe to get the odds in your favor by looking at the signs of the moon. It also has transplants, if you're transplanting plants in your garden and whatnot. My son Jeff and my wife Barb go totally by Dick's calendar. And Jeff last year had record watermelons last year. I mean, they were the biggest watermelons I've ever seen. And so there must be something to it. And then Dick always says, if the gravitation of the moon can pull the tides, the oceans, it does have effect on people and plants. So here's another ace in the hole for looking at when it's best to plant. So that brings us to the corny jokes, and I thought I'd do a couple of them. One of them is kind of a spring joke, and one of them is an Easter joke. The first one is the Easter joke. It said, "What did one Easter egg say to the other? Heard any good yolks recently?" Now, the other one, we had a lot of rain here in West Point a couple of weeks ago, and we saw earthworms everywhere. I mean, that fresh smell you get, with the earth kind of warming up and whatnot. So what did the mother worm say to the little worm who was late? "Where in earth have you been?" Well, thanks for watching today. And if you notice, we have a new table. We'll give credit to my brother Henry. He donated the wood because we told him when he was on he had to do something to be on Cup of Joe. But no, he donated the wood. I don't know if you know, my brother Henry's an amateur wood person, I guess you might say. And then a local carpenter did the construction of it. So, and one of the things we've heard from our listeners that they'd like to see us talk to them a little bit more than each other. I don't know why you'd want to see me over somebody else, but anyhow, just thought I'd tell you that. And again, I hope I have a happy Easter, and hope your family is healthy. Hope you got your COVID vaccine, and let's get ready to plant. Take care.